Hi everybody, welcome back. Today we are going to be talking about group development. So this is a lecture that is designed and used for group communication, small group communication, as well as potentially organizational communication. It is a pretty broad look at some of the ways that we can and should develop our groups, some of the different phases, some of the different processes, and hopefully we can get some clearer understanding, some clearer ideas about how we can purposefully and systematically create groups, do things purposefully so that our groups can be as effective as possible. And I know from my experience, most students don't particularly like group work. Most people, in my experience, don't particularly like group work. And that's not because group work is inferior or should be avoided in any way. Group work can be really amazing, especially when it comes to handling large tasks, handling large projects. And if we want to be able to do that, we have to think critically, we have to think purposefully about how we develop our groups and the things that we do. So to highlight some of these things, we're going to talk about some of the different group dimensions. We'll talk about the Tuckman model of group development. We'll talk about 4 of those aspects. Sometimes it's 5, but we're just going to talk about 4, and then we'll have a quick review. So this should be a pretty short lecture. Highly recommend taking some notes, though, because there is quite a bit of information. So first and foremost, we have to think about our different group dimensions. So we have 2 different group dimensions here. Again, it depends on who you read, who you talk to, who you look at, as far as determining different group dimensions, different types of groups, all of that kind of stuff. But I like to keep it simple and just break it down to task and social groups. Task groups are going to be our work or product focus group. We have a task that we have to complete. Whether that's a small task, a large task, whether it's a recurring task, it doesn't really matter. If we come together in a group to work on a task, to complete a task, to solve a problem, then we are in a task group. So this little quote here is that productivity is the result of the efficient and effective accomplishment of a group task. So tasks and group development and productivity are all linked together. The second type of group dimension we have here is social. This is more relationship focused. It is used to build more cohesiveness, to build better relationships between people in the group. This is going to be uniquely important for groups that are going to have a longer time when they have to work together, a shorter time, so say like a work group for a class, you're focused on a task. You might not put as much effort into the social element, but if you're going to work with that group for a year, say, then you would want to put more effort into this social element, the social bonds, the relationships that bring those people together. So when you're looking at group dimensions, you can highlight different things to do different things. You can focus on task work, but at the same time, you can focus on the social element. So when I was in graduate school, one of the ways that we would do this is we would come together for class, and I was in the same cohort with the same people for most of my time in graduate school, and we would work on tasks. We would work in groups together for different classes. We would do different things to complete different tasks and also develop those social elements. So we would get together outside of class occasionally. After a class, we would go get dinner or go get a drink or something of that nature. And what we ended up doing was building a pretty cohesive group, and we started leaning on each other throughout those couple of years that allowed us to really have a positive experience for the most part in graduate school. So we have to be thinking about different tasks and different social elements. We have to be thinking about how we can develop our group in a purposeful, effective way based on the needs of our group. So when we're trying to build cohesiveness, which is one of the key elements of that social dimension, we first and foremost have to think about encouraging compatible membership. That means bringing people together that are going to get along, that are going to be compatible, but that are also going to be able to work together effectively. This can be challenging, it can be really problematic, and it's one of those things that particularly people in leadership roles have to focus on, because you're trying to bring a group together that will be able to work together and get along and do the things that they need to do. So you have to be aware of that. That goes back to some of the boundary control, some of the stuff we talked about when we were talking about groups as systems. Those different types of input will directly impact the output or the product. So we have to think about people in that way, as well as personalities and skills and traits and all of those other characteristics. The second thing we want to be thinking about is developing shared goals. Now, this is super important because we talked about developing a code of conduct and highlighting how we can use a code of conduct to guide our interactions to make sure that we are doing what we need to do and we have a procedure for handling different things from conflict to decision making. But we also have to develop shared goals, and this is a key aspect to creating cooperation, creating motivation between people. If everybody in the group, everybody in the organization, everybody in the team has a say in what those goals are and they're all on board with accomplishing those goals, you're going to have more cohesive interactions between people. Now, if people are not on board with those goals, then you're going to have more pushback. The group's not going to function as effectively. So just for example, when I was in graduate school, I worked at Starbucks, and when I first went in there was a lot of disturbance within the group. A new store manager had just come in, and that new leader was evaluating the group and trying to find compatible membership, but also trying to find people who shared common goals. And one of the things that they did to try and highlight that is they brought together the shift supervisors, did a little leadership activity, and tried to get them to get to know each other a little bit, to develop and build the social element of the group, and brought them to an escape room. And rather than participate, because they didn't want to alter the interactions, they watched and observed, because there are cameras in most escape rooms, and watched and observed. And through that, they were able to really clearly identify who was going to work well together in different stressful situations and who wasn't. And then when they came back together, they started talking about creating common goals, and really quickly identified that a couple of those people that were in management or in supervisor positions, they weren't going to be on board with the new approach, the new goals, and were no longer going to be compatible members of the group, and they were let go, which is unfortunate. But from a group perspective, it's not necessarily a bad thing, because we do want to be thinking about developing goals, creating compatible membership, and accomplishing tasks. And it's not just accomplishing tasks, but 3 and 4 go hand in hand here. It's really about developing a positive history of cooperation. We have to accomplish tasks, even if they're small tasks. So when your group first comes together, make little easy tasks, things that can be completed quickly, easily, and start to develop a history of positive cooperation. This will avoid a negativity bias, and a negativity bias essentially can determine or explain why we feel negatively about any one thing. And so when we have 3 negative experiences to every one positive experience, we will develop a negativity bias. But then once we have that negativity bias, it takes 5 positive interactions for every 1 negative to overcome that negativity bias. So when your group first comes together, you have to have positive interactions. You have to really emphasize that. You have to really emphasize completing tasks and doing different things. That's super important. And the last bit here is promoting acceptance of group members and being inclusive. This is really vital. You have to create space for people to be themselves, to be comfortable, to state their ideas, to state their opinions, to explore new ideas, to explore new roles, to take on new tasks. If you don't create, and I know this is kind of a controversial term, but if you don't create a safe space for the people in your group, it can create really big issues with how you develop your group and how effective your group is. Now, that's not to say you can't have conflict, you can't have negative interactions with somebody, but if you and I, per se, have a history of positive interactions and we have interacted with each other seamlessly for, say, 15 or 20 interactions, we can afford to have one negative interaction where we disagree, where we don't see eye to eye on something and we have some conflict, and that's okay because we've developed that history of positive cooperation. We have worked together successfully to accomplish tasks. We have hopefully abided by our code of conduct, and while we were having conflict, we were doing so respectfully, and we are still compatible members of the group. So it's really important to think about positivity and creating space for people to challenge themselves and challenge each other. Now, moving forward and a little bit away from group dimensions and more towards one of the models for group development, we have Tuckman's model of group development, which is 4 or 5 phases. We'll just talk about 4, and we'll go into more detail with them here in just a second. The first phase is forming, so this is the initial formation of the group. Second phase is storming. This is when tension or conflict first occurs. Then we have norming. This is when standards, rules, or norms are developed. And then performing. This is where we are doing the task, whatever we need to complete, and this is really our output. So thinking back to systems theory. So step 1, stage 1 is forming. So this requires that we think about, why do we join groups? You all know, right, as human beings, why we do something is sometimes more important than what we're doing. If I join a group at a company simply because I need a job, and that's the only job I can get, that is going to change the way that I interact, because I don't really want to be there, right? I'm there because I have to be, and that's what I have to do. But where I want to be is somewhere else, and that's going to change the way that I interact. So we have to be thinking about why and how we form groups. The objectives of the forming phase are to, 1, get to know each other, get to know the members, start to develop those social bonds, really highlight the social dimension of that group, and then also start thinking about the task and whatever tasks you have to complete. Number 2 is to find commonality and start to develop cohesion. So we have to start to get to know each other. We have to start to develop that positive history of cooperation. We have to avoid negative or problematic behavior. We want to avoid negativity bias at all costs. This is super important. And then we have to establish clear goals. So one of the things that we can do in one of our first meetings as a group is set our code of conduct, establish our clear goals, and start to just interact, start to get to know each other, start to work through different things. And this is something that I highlight, I would say, pretty effectively in my argumentation and debate classes, because the first week when we come to class, everybody does an introduction speech, and it's silly, it's not really super formal, and it's a complete incomplete assignment. So if you do it, you get a perfect score. It's very low level kind of assignment. But after that, the group as a whole starts working towards developing our code of conduct, because we are in a class where people are going to be arguing, they're going to be debating, and in my classes, the students get to pick whatever topic they want. We end up with 3 or 4 topics for the entire class, and then they pick from them. So when we're forming, when the group first comes together, we have a task immediately, and that is to develop a code of conduct, try to get insight from everybody, try to make sure everybody discusses what's going on. It typically takes 2 weeks, about 2 weeks, to develop the code of conduct. But in doing that, I've had an opportunity to interact with everybody. They've all had opportunities to interact with each other. We often have conflict right away when we're thinking about what and how we want to talk about different things. And then we work past that and we create a history of positive cooperation. And so far, I haven't had any issues in any of my argumentation and debate classes. And we've talked about things ranging from universal health care to animal rights to, and one of my favorite topics was legalizing the use of all illicit substances, which was quite interesting. And again, the students pick those topics. So it works out really well when we're thinking about forming, we're thinking about developing those tasks and social dimensions. Once we form the group, once we start to develop that positive history of cooperation, we have to start thinking about the storming phase, because conflict is inevitable. We know that. You know that. As human beings, we have a lot of conflict, and it's not a bad thing. It's not something to be shied away from. It can actually improve our relationships, because if we have a conflict, we work past that, our relationship actually gets stronger, because now we can trust each other. We can understand how one person is going to act. We gain more insights in how they are going to communicate in that environment. So one way to really handle this is to develop a code of conduct. Be very explicit about it. If we have a situation like, example, here's how we'll handle it. If we have a situation where in my debate class somebody gets really frustrated, they get really upset, here's how we're going to handle that. And we have a code of this semester, one of our codes is that we have a 24-hour cooldown period, where if somebody gets too emotionally engaged, then we have 24-hour cooldown period, and then we will talk about it. And if a student and another student have some kind of issue, the three of us will have a conversation about that and try and work past it. So we have these set codes that help us manage these different types of tension. We have two different types of tension. Number one is primary. So this is that initial discomfort we have when we first join a group. When our first group meeting, we're first getting to know each other. And then we have secondary tension, which is more related to the task or our personality. So once we get to know each other a little bit, once we have a better idea of how consistent somebody's going to be, how we can trust how they're going to communicate and interact, we're going to inevitably have secondary tension, which is going to come down to something as simple as, I think we should do one thing, you think we should do another thing, how do we work past that? And having that clear code of conduct will help us do that. The code of conduct works in a lot of different ways. It helps us form, it helps us storm, but it works really, really well for norming. And this is the third stage in Tuckman's model. So norming is when we develop the rules, the norms, the guidelines for how we're going to interact as a group. How are we going to converse with each other? What are our means of communication? What is our communication network going to look like? Who's going to have what role? What roles are going to do what? We start to really develop the foundation of our group. We start to develop some of those barriers, right? So we can limit input, and it helps with managing a lot of different things. So we have a few different types of norms. The first one is explicit. The second one is implicit. So an explicit norm is a rule that is expressly identified and acceptable, or expressly identified as acceptable or unacceptable behavior. So again, in my class code of conduct for argumentation and debate, one of the codes is that no person's identity is going to be targeted in any debate, whatever that might be, whether it's race, sex, gender, ethnicity, sexual orientation. We are not attacking the person. We are talking about the argument, the research, and what argument is being proposed. That's really important. That's explicit. That's also in our course syllabus. So if you are in college, you've had a course syllabus, and that is explicitly stating, here's what we're going to do, here's what we're not going to do, here's when we're going to do it, here's how we're going to do it. Hopefully, that's what your syllabus says. Then we have implicit norms, and these come from within the group. They are our consistencies within our behavior, within our attitudes. You might act one way in one group and another way in another group. In one group, you might be less engaged, less talkative. You might not want a leadership role, and then in another group, you might take on more of a leadership role. And that has to do with those interactions. We determine what is acceptable and what is unacceptable oftentimes by just simply communicating. So when we're thinking about norms, we have to think about explicit and implicit, but we also have to think about where those norms, where those rules, where those guidelines are coming from. And we have two different areas. We have without the group and within the group. So without the group comes from outside of the group. So it's not without the group being there, it's you have the group, it comes from without, because norms that come from within the group are from the group members. So sources of norms that are without the group are things like rules, laws, social norms, cultural norms, the setting, the context, the expectations. These are things that impact us in our groups regardless of how we want to go about it. The norms from within the group, these are things like our personal beliefs, our personal values, our codes of conduct. These are the things that make us us, and it helps us develop our group identity. Once we have formed, stormed, normed, we then need to perform. And this is the final stage, and depending on how you look at it, it's the final stage of Tuckman's model that we'll talk about today, and that is performing. And this is where we complete the task that the group has been working toward. So that could be presenting, competing, performing, right? It can be anything. It's the final task. It's the thing that brought you all together. Now we have to be thinking about some of the different contextual issues, the different situational elements, because if we're in a class at the end of the semester, that group goes away, right? Unless some of those students take that same professor again, you continue that relationship, you continue to build those bonds, all of a sudden it's a little bit of a different situation in the next semester, right? You can also think about a work group. So maybe you have a work group It doesn't go well, you separate, group ends, and then you have to come back together, right? You have to think about you're going to have to perform again without allowing those other negative interactions to take away from that. So performing is the final stage that we're going to talk about today. The fifth stage is, in Tuckman's model, can be seen as adjourning, which is just when the group ends. But one of the common things that we see when we are working in groups is that the concept called social loafing. And this is when one or multiple group members don't do their part. You all know this. You may have been this person. I've been this person. I've also been irritated with this person. So it depends on the group. But we have all had this particular situation, whether we've been that person or been impacted by it. But it really is caused by a lack of cohesion in the group. So if we are seeing social loafing, we have to make some changes. We have to rethink our task and social elements. We have to rethink our code of conduct. We have to rethink, do we have that positive history of cooperation? Do we have shared goals? Do we have that code of conduct? So we have to think about, how do we manage social loafing? And I have a few different things you can do. It's not necessarily in this particular order, but number one is kind of where we can start, and 9, of course, gets us to some of our more radical measures. So step 1 in managing social loafing is to make sure that we assign meaningful tasks. It's very important that people feel like their contributions are valued and needed within the group. Number 2 is to establish a norm of responsibility. This goes back to your code of conduct. Are people going to be held accountable, and who's going to be responsible for what? This goes a little bit hand in hand with having meaningful tasks. Assign those tasks, and those are people's tasks. There's nothing worse than being micromanaged, and it just feels like, you know what, if you don't trust me to do it yourself. So we have to avoid that. We have to highlight member importance, highlight that the success of the group, of the team, of the organization depends on that interconnectedness, depends on that synergy, depends on the fact that we impact each other, and we have to work toward having a relationship where I understand and take seriously that my actions will positively or negatively impact the group or you individually. We have to hold members accountable, which again comes back to the code of conduct. It leans a little bit into leadership. We have to improve cohesiveness, so we do that by highlighting the social elements of the group, getting to know each other, and developing that positive history of cooperation, developing clear goals, creating a space for people to be comfortable, to be themselves. And if none of that works, then we have to confront the person, confront the social loafer. Find out what's going on. You would be surprised. One of the things that I come across in class quite regularly is we'll have a situation where somebody is social loafing, and the group will come to me and be really frustrated by that. And I will say, well, have you talked to them about it? Say, well, no, we're uncomfortable doing that. And so we'll end up having a conversation as a group, and it turns out that that person, their hours changed at work. They're having something going on in their life, and they don't feel comfortable talking to their group about it, but they didn't want to say anything about it because they said that they would do their part, and they're doing their best, but right now their best is not what the group's looking for. So how do we figure that out, right? It's not somebody who's purposefully not doing their work, not doing their part, but they're having a tough time completing that task because of these other outside variables. Well, as a group, we have to figure out, how do we solve that problem, right? It's not about having a bad group member. It's about life being chaotic and having to work through that. Number 7 is consult a position of higher authority, which is what students will do with me quite regularly rather than confront each other or even work on steps 1 through 6. It's immediately come to me, and then I ask them, did we work through these other steps? If not, why? And let's start working on that. And usually, not always, of course, usually that solves the problem. If that doesn't solve the problem, we may have to either remove the person from the group or move around the person in the group. Now, sidestepping the loafer essentially is us not allowing them to impede our ability to do what we want to do. Now, of course, that's not necessarily a good thing, but if you can't remove the person from the group, you might just have to figure out how to work around them. And that's the nature of group development and group work. It's not always going to be pretty. It's not always going to be fun, but we have to be thinking about it like we think about relationships. It takes work. We have to be systematic and purposeful in those things. So today we talked about the different group dimensions, so task and social dimensions. We talked about the different phases of Tuckman's model of group development, which are forming, storming, norming, and performing. And then we talked about some ways to manage social loafing. So I hope that you will all apply this information, think about this information, and ultimately have better, more successful interactions in your groups, your teams, and your organizations. Bye, everybody.